Continuing Alcibiades from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Their fleet maintained itself here and issued from these headquarters to reduce such as had revolted and protect the rest of the territories in one way or other, still contriving to be a match for their enemies at sea. What they stood in fear of was Tissaphernes and the Phoenician fleet of 150 galleys, which was said to be already under sail. If those came, there remained then no hopes for the commonwealth of Athens. Understanding this, Alcibiades sent secretly to the chief men of the Athenians, who were then at Samos, giving them hopes that he would make Tissaphernes their friend. He was willing, he implied, to do some favor, not to the people, not in reliance upon them, but to the better citizens, if only, like brave men, they would make the attempt to put down the insolence of the people, and by taking upon them the government, would endeavor to save the city from ruin. Now see, if there's enough good people, it protects the other people. All of them gave a ready ear to the proposal made by Alcibiades, except only Phrynichus of the township of Dryden, one of the generals, who suspected, as the truth was, that Alcibiades concerned not himself whether the government were in the people or the better citizens, but only sought by any means to make way for his return into his native country, and to that end invade against the people, thereby to gain the others, and to insinuate himself into their good opinion. But when Phrynichus found his counsel to be rejected, and that he was himself to become a declared enemy of Alcibiades, he gave secret intelligence to Astyochus, the enemy's admiral, cautioning him to beware of Alcibiades and to seize him as a double dealer, unaware that one traitor was making discoveries to another. For Astyochus, who was eager to gain the favor of Tissaphernes, observing the credit Alcibiades had with him, revealed to Alcibiades all that Phrynichus had said against him. Alcibiades at once dispatched messengers to Samos to accuse Phrynichus of the treachery. Upon this, all the commanders were enraged with Phrynichus and set themselves against him. He, seeing no other way to extricate himself from the present danger, attempted to remedy one evil by a greater. He sent to Astyochus to reproach him for betraying him, and to make and offered him at the same time to deliver into his hands both the army and the navy of the Athenians. This occasioned no damage to the Athenians, because Astyochus repeated his treachery and revealed also this proposal to Alcibiades. But this, again, was foreseen by Phrynichus, who, expecting a second accusation from Alcibiades to anticipate him, advertised the Athenians beforehand that the enemy was ready to set sail in order to surprise them, and therefore advised them to fortify their camp and to be in readiness to go abroad their ships. While the Athenians were intent upon doing these things, they received other letters from Alcibiades, admonishing them to beware of Phrynichus as one who designed to betray their fleet to the enemy, to which they then gave no credit at all, conceiving that Alcibiades, who knew perfectly the counsels and preparations of the enemy, was merely making use of that knowledge in order to impose upon them in this false accusation of Phrynichus. Yet afterwards, when Phrynichus was stabbed with a dagger in the marketplace by Hermon, one of the guards. The Athenians, entering into an examination of the cause, solemnly condemned Phrynichus of treason and decreed crowns to Hermon and his associates. And now the friends of Alcibiades, carrying all before them at Samos, dispatched Pisander to Athens to attempt a change of government and to encourage the aristocratical citizens to take upon themselves the government and overthrow the democracy, presenting to them that they, upon these terms, Alcibiades would procure them the friendship and alliance of Tissaphernes. This was the color and pretense made use of by those who desired to change the government of Athens to an oligarchy, like America has. But as soon as they prevailed and had got the administration of affairs into their hands, under the name of the 5,000, whereas indeed they were but 400, they slighted Alcibiades altogether. They prosecuted the war with less vigor, partly because they durst not yet trust the citizens who secretly detested this change, and partly because they thought the Lacedaemonians, who always befriended the government of the few, would be inclined to give them favorable terms. The people in the city were terrified into submission, many of those who had dared openly to oppose the 400 having been put to death, but those who were at Samos, indignant when they heard this news, were eager to set sail instantly for the Piraeus. Sending for Alcibiades, they declared him general, requiring him to lead them on to put down the tyrants. He, however, in that juncture did not, as it might have been thought a man would, on being suddenly exalted by the favor of a multitude, think himself under an obligation to gratify and submit to all the wishes of those who, from a fugitive and an exile, had created him general of so great an army and had given him the commander of such a fleet. But as become a great captain, he opposed himself to participate resolutions which their rage led them to, and by restraining them from the great error they were about to commit, unequivocally saved the commonwealth. For if they had sailed to Athens, all Ionia and the islands and the Hellespont would have fallen into the enemy's hands without opposition, while the Athenians involved in the civil war would have been fighting with one another within the circuit of their own walls. It was Alcibiades alone, or at least principally, who prevented all this mischief, for he not only used persuasion the whole army, he showed them the danger, but applied himself to them, one by one, entreating some and constraining others. He was much assisted, however, by Thrasybulus of Styria, who, having the loudest voice, as we are told, of all the Athenians, went along with him and cried out to those who were ready to be gone. A second great service which Alcibiades did for them was his undertaking that the Phoenician fleet, which the Lacedaemonians expected to be sent to them by the king of Persia, should either come in aid of the Athenians or otherwise should not come at all. He sailed off with all expedition in order to perform this, and the ships which had already been seen as near as Aspendas were not brought any further by Tissaphernes, who thus deceived the Lacedaemonians, and was by both sides believed that they had been diverted by the procurement of Alcibiades. The Lacedaemonians in particular accused him that he had advised the barbarian to stand still and suffer the Greeks and waste and destroy one another, as it was evident that the accession of so great a force to either party would enable them to take away the entire dominion of the sea from the other side. Soon after this, the 400 usurpers were driven out, the friends of Alcibiades vigorously assisting those who were for the popular government. And now the people in the city not only desired but commanded Alcibiades to return home from his exile. He, however, desired not to owe his return to the mere grace and commiseration of the people, and resolved to come back not with empty hands, but with glory, after some service done. To this end he sailed from Samos with a few ships, and cruised on the sea of Cnidos, and about the Isle of Cos, but receiving intelligence there that Mindarus, the Spartan admiral, had sailed with his whole army into the Hellespont, and that the Athenians had followed him, he hurried back to secure the Athenian commanders, and by good fortune arrived with 18 galleys at a critical time, for both the fleets, having engaged near Abydos, the flight between them had lasted till night, the one side leaving the advantage on one quarter and the other on another. Upon his first appearance, both sides formed a false impression. The enemy encouraged, the Athenians were terrified. But Alcibiades suddenly raised the Athenian ensign in the admiralship, and fell upon those galleys of the Peloponnesians which had the advantage, and were in pursuit. He soon put these to flight, and followed them so close that he forced them on shore, and broke the ships in pieces, the sailors abandoning them and swimming away in spite of all the efforts of Pharnabazus, who had come down to their assistance by land, and did what he could to protect them from the shore. In fine, the Athenians, having taken 30 of the enemy's ships and recovered all their own, erected a trophy. After gaining so glorious a victory, his vanity made him eager to show himself to Tissaphernes, and having furnished himself with gifts and presents and equipage suitable to his dignity, he set out to visit him. But the thing did not succeed as he had imagined, for Tissaphernes had been long suspected by the Lacedaemonians, and was afraid to fall into disgrace with his king upon that account, and therefore thought that Alcibiades arrived very opportunely, and immediately caused him to be seized and sent away prisoner to Sardis, fancying by this act of injustice to clear himself from all former imputations. But about 30 days after, Alcibiades escaped from his keeping, and having got a horse, fled to Clazomena, where he procured Tissaphernes additional disgrace by professing he was a party to his escape. From there sailed to the Athenian camp, and being informed there that Mindarus and Pharnabazus were together at Cyzicus, he made a speech to the soldiers, telling them that sea fighting, land fighting, and by the entities considered to be gods and goddesses, fighting against fortified cities too, must all be one for them, as unless they conquered everywhere, there was no money for them. As soon as ever he got them on shipboard, he hastened to Proconnesus, and gave command to seize all the small vessels they met, and guard them safely in the interior of the fleet, and the enemy might have no notice of his coming. And a great storm of rain, accompanied with thunder and darkness, which happened at the same time, contributed much to the concealment of his enterprise. Indeed, it was not only undiscovered by the enemy, but the Athenians themselves were ignorant of it, for he commanded them suddenly on board, and he set sail when they had abandoned all intention of it. As the darkness presently passed away, the Peloponnesian fleet was seen riding out at sea in front of the harbor of Cyzicus. Fearing, if they discovered the number of his ships, they might endeavor to save themselves by land, he commanded the rest of the captains to slacken and follow him slowly, whilst he, advancing with 40 ships, showed himself to the enemy, and provoked them to fight. The enemy, being deceived as to their numbers, despised them, and supposing they were to contend with those only, made themselves ready, and began the fight. But as soon as they were engaged, they perceived the other part of the fleet coming down upon them, at which they were so terrified that they fled immediately. Upon that Alcibiades, breaking through the midst of them with 20 of his best ships, hastened to the shore, disembarked and pursued those who abandoned their ships and fled to land, and made a great slaughter of them. Mindarus and Pharnabazus, coming to their succor, were utterly defeated. Mindarus was slain upon the place, fighting valiantly. Pharnabazus saved himself by flight. The Athenians slew great numbers of their enemies, won much spoil, and took all their ships. They also made themselves masters of Cyzicus, which was deserted by Pharnabazus, and destroyed its Peloponnesian garrison, and thereby not only secured to themselves the Hellespont, but by force drove the Lacedaemonians out from the rest of the sea. They intercepted some letters written to the ephors, which gave an account of this fatal overthrow. After their short, laconic manner, our hopes are at an end. Mindarus is slain. The men starve. We know not what to do. The soldiers who followed Alcibiades in the last fight were so exalted with their success, and felt that degree of pride, that, looking on themselves as invincible, they disdained to mix with the other soldiers who had been often overcome, for it happened not long before Thrasyllus had received a defeat near Ephesus. Upon that occasion the Ephesians erected the brazen trophy to the disgrace of the Athenians. The soldiers of Alcibiades reproached those who were under the command of Thrasyllus with this misfortune, at the same time magnifying themselves and their own commander, and it went so far that they would not exercise with them nor lodge in the same quarters. But soon after, Pharnabazus, with a great force of horse and foot, falling upon the soldiers of Thrasyllus as they were laying waste to the territory of Abydos, Alcibiades came to their aid, routed Pharnabazus, together with Thrasyllus, pursued him till it was night, and in this action the troops united and returned together to the camp, rejoicing and congratulating one another. The next day he erected a trophy, and then proceeded to lay waste, with fire and sword, the whole province, which was under Pharnabazus, where none ventured to resist, and he took divers priests and priestesses, but released them without ransom. He prepared next to attack the Chalcedonians, or is it the Chalcedonians? I don't see Greek characters here, so excuse that. Had revolted from the Athenians, and had received a Lacedaemonian governor and garrison, but having intelligence that they had removed their corn and cattle out of the fields, and were conveying it to all the Bithynians, who were their friends, and drew down his army from the frontier of the Bithynians, and sent a herald to charge them with this proceeding. The Bithynians, terrified at his reproach, delivered up to him the booty, and entered into alliance with him. Afterwards, he proceeded to the siege of Chalcedon, and enclosed it with a wall from sea to sea. Pharnabazus advanced with his forces to raise the siege, and Hippocrates, the governor of the town, at the same time, gathering together all the strength he had, made a sally upon the Athenians. Alcibiades divided his army so as to engage both at once, and not only forced Pharnabazus to a dishonorable flight, but defeated Hippocrates and killed him and a number of the soldiers with him. And after this he sailed into Hellespont in order to raise supplies of money, and took the city of Selembria, in which action, through his precipitation, he exposed himself to great danger, for some within the town had undertaken to betray it into his hands, and by agreement were to give him a signal by a lighted torch about midnight. But one of the conspirators, beginning to repent himself of the design, the rest, for fear of being discovered, were driven to give the signal before the appointed hour. Alcibiades, as soon as he saw the torch lifted up into the air, though his army was not in readiness to march, ran instantly towards the walls, taking with him about 30 men only, and commanding the rest of the army to follow him with all possible speed. When he came hither, he found the gate open for him, and entered with his 30 men and about 20 more light-armed men who were come up to them. They were no sooner in the city, but he perceived the Celebrians, all armed, coming down upon him, so that there was no hope of escaping if he stayed to receive them, and on the other hand, having been always successful till that day, wherever he commanded, he could not endure to be defeated and fly. So, requiring silence by sound of a trumpet, he commanded one of his men to make proclamation that the Celebrians should not take arms against the Athenians. This cooled such of the inhabitants as were fiercest for the fight, for they supposed that all their enemies were within the walls, and it raised the hopes of others who were disposed to an accommodation. Whilst they were parleying and prepositions making on one side and the other, Alcibiades, his whole army, came up to the town, and now, conjecturing rightly that the Celebrians were well inclined to peace, and fearing lest the city might be sacked by the Thracians, who came in great numbers to his army to serve as volunteers, out of kindness for him, he commanded them all to retreat without the walls, and upon the submission of the Celebrians he saved them from being pillaged, only taking of them a sum of money, and after placing an Athenian garrison in the town, departed. During this action the Athenian captains who besieged Chalcedon concluded a treaty with Pharnabazus upon these articles, that he should give them a sum of money, that the Chalcedonians should return the subject of Athens, and that the Athenians should make no inroad into the province whereof Pharnabazus was governor, and Pharnabazus was also to provide safe conducts for the Athenian ambassadors to the king of Persia. Afterwards, when Alcibiades returned thither, Pharnabazus required that he also should be sworn to the treaty, but he refused it unless Pharnabazus would swear at the same time. When the treaty was sworn to on both sides, Alcibiades went against the Byzantines, who had revolted from the Athenians, and drew a line of circumvallation about the city. But Anaxilaus and Lycurgus, together with some others, having undertaken to betray the city to him, upon his engagement to preserve the lives and property of its inhabitants, he caused a report to be spread abroad, as if by reason of some unexpected movement in Ionia, he should be obliged to raise the siege, and accordingly that day he made a show to depart with his whole fleet, but returned the same night, and went ashore with all his men at arms, and silently, undiscovered, marched up the walls. At the same time his ships rowed into the harbor with all possible violence, coming on with much fury, and with great shouts and outcries. The Byzantines, thus surprised and astonished, while they all hurried to the defense of their port and shipping, gave opportunity to those who favored the Athenians securely to receive Alcibiades into the city. Yet the enterprise was not accomplished without fighting, for the Peloponnesians, Boeotians, and Megarians not only repulsed those who came out of the ships and forced them on board again, but hearing that the Athenians were entered on the other side, drew up in order and went to meet them. Alcibiades, however, gained the victory after some sharp fighting, in which he himself had the command of the right wing, and Theramenes of the left, and he took about 300 who survived of the enemy prisoners of war. Now, sort of a side note, nothing really to do with this. In America, we have the the true right wing is, furthest right wing would be anarchy, and ultimate totalitarianism would be furthest left. And in the middle, you have democracy, and republic is a little bit to the left of democracy. And to the right of democracy, you would have a constitutional democracy. Oh, did I stop mid-sentence? And took about 300 who survived of the enemy prisoners of war. After the battle, not one of the Byzantines was slain or driven out of the city according to the terms upon which the city was put in his hands, that they should receive no prejudice in life or property. And thus Anaxilaus, being afterwards accused at Lacedaemon, for this treason, neither disowned nor professed to be ashamed of the action, for he urged that he was not a Lacedaemonian, but a Byzantine, and saw not Sparta, but Byzantium in extreme danger, the city so blockaded that it was not possible to bring in any new provisions, and the Peloponnesians and Boeotians who were in garrison devouring the old stores, whilst the Byzantines, with their wives and children, were starving, that he had not therefore betrayed his country to enemies, but had delivered it from the calamities of war, and had but followed the example of the most worthy Lacedaemonians, who esteemed nothing to be honorable and just, but what was profitable for their country. The Lacedaemonians, upon hearing his defense, respected it and discharged all that were accused. And now Alcibiades began to desire to see his native country again, or rather to show his fellow citizens a person who had gained so many victories for them. He set sail for Athens, the ships that accompanied him being adorned with great numbers of shields and other spoils, and towing after them many galleys taken from the enemy, and the ensigns and ornaments of many others, which he had sunk and destroyed, all of them together amounting to 200. Little credit, perhaps, can be given to what Doris, the Samian, who professed to be descended from Alcibiades, adds that Chrysogonus, who had gained a victory at the Pythian games, played upon his flute for the galleys, whilst the oars kept time with the music, and that Celepidas, the tragedian, attired in his buskins, his purple robes, and other ornaments used in the theatre, gave the word to the rowers that the admiral galley entered in the port with a purple sail. Neither Theopompus nor Ephorus nor Xenophon mentioned them, nor indeed is it credible that one who returned from so long an exile and such variety of misfortunes should come home to his countrymen in the style of revellers breaking up from a drinking party. Now, perhaps he saved it for an occasion, but yeah. On the contrary, he ventured the harbor full of fear, nor would he venture to go on shore till, standing on the deck, he saw Euryptolemus, his cousin, and others of his friends and acquaintance, who were ready to receive him and invited him to land. As soon as he was landed, the multitude who came out to meet him scarcely seemed so much to see any of the other captains, but came in throngs about Alcibiades, and saluted him with loud acclamations, and still followed him. Those who could press near him stayed to behold him afar off, and the old men pointed him out and showed him to the young ones. Nevertheless, this public joy was mixed with some tears, and the present happiness was alloyed by the remembrance of miseries they had endured. They made reflections that they could not have so unfortunately miscarried in Sicily or been defeated in any of their other expectations, if they had left the management of their affairs formally and the command of their forces to Alcibiades, since, upon his undertaking the administration, when they were in a manner driven from the sea, and could scarce defend the suburbs of their city by land, and at the same time were miserably distracted with intestine factions, he had raised them up from this low and deplorable condition, and had not only restored them to their ancient dominion of the sea, but had also made them everywhere victorious over their enemies on land. There had been a decree for recalling him from his banishment already passed by the people at the instance of Critias, the son of Calascrus, as appears by his elegies, in which he puts Alcibiades in mind of the service. From my proposal did that edict come, which, from your tedious exile, brought you home. The public vote at first was moved by me, and my voice put the seal to the decree. The people being summoned to an assembly, Alcibiades came in amongst them, and first bewailed and lamented his own sufferings, and in gentle terms complaining of the usage he had received, imputing all to his hard fortune, and some ill genius that attended him, and he spoke at large of their prospects, and exhorted them to courage and good hope. And the people crowned him with crowns of gold, and created him general both at land and sea with absolute power, and they made a decree that his estate should be restored to him, and that Eumolpida and the holy herald should absolve him from the curses which they solemnly pronounced against him by sentence of the people, which, while the rest obeyed, Theodorus the high priest excused himself, for, said he, if he is innocent, I never cursed him. Yeah, it's good to put that sort of condition on the curses, is that that what if you're wrong? So, if the person deserves it, and make it a conditional thing,